¿Qué más? ¿Qué hay de nuevo?
What's up?
Salut!
Hi, again, welcome to this podcast. Thanks for being here. Today, as we've been doing it on the last podcast, we are going to talk about a great movie. This is called The Breadwinner, a 2017 animated drama film directed by Nora Toomey, produced by Mimi Polk and Angelina Jolie. This movie had a good critical response. In fact, it has an approval rating of 95%, and The Guardian gave the film 5 stars. This movie is based on a novel with the same name, wrote by Deborah Ellis, and the story explores Taliban patriarchy, misogyny, anti-intellectualism placed in Afghanistan.
Now about the plot. Parwana is an Afghan girl. She's 11 years old. She and her family live in this country which is under the control of the Taliban. She works with her father in the public market because Narulya, his father, needs help due to his physical disability. One day he was unjustly arrested thanks to a young member of the Taliban, Idris, who thought he was insulted by Parwana. As a consequence, Parwana's family was isolated and unprotected. So Parwana decided to help her family by cutting her long hair and by dressing as a boy. She works many hours during the day to gather money in order to save her father, who is in prison in the middle of the desert. Thus, Parwana will face many adventures that display women inequalities in an Islamic country.
Saying that, we would like to focus our attention on two of the various aspects of the film. These are the actual situation of women and children, both in the context of the film and that what happens here in Colombia.
So our idea is to talk about women's situation in this first part of the podcast. And the movie talks about the control of men over women in Afghanistan. Women have to behave in certain ways in order to respect men. If a woman disobeys her father or husband, the society would describe them as a shame to their family. In this way, something that really caught my attention was the fact that women are taught through physical punishment. If a woman breaks the law, such as leaving home without the company of a man, they can be punished by hitting them all on their bodies.
And it's a fact that Afghanistan is still the worst place in the world to be a woman. But there is a particularity. The violence against women in Afghanistan is the result of the takeover by the Taliban regime. Before that, in the early 70s, Afghanistan was often viewed as more progressive than other close countries when it came to women's rights. Back then, women were able to pursue an education, get a job, and vote. But when this Islamic fundamentalist group seized control in the mid-90s, everything changed and violent acts increased. Actually, the laws were established against the human rights of women and girls. Now, as you said and as the movie portrays, women couldn't or can't even leave the house without a male guardian, and it is required to wear a burqa so as not to show any bare skin. If not, eventually that means brutal punishments. Also, there is violence in discrimination, and the fact that women are not allowed to read, write, or even learn is sadly a reality. In Afghanistan, only 19% of females under 15 years old are literate. No one felt it is important to have an educated woman. In the movie, we can see Parwana's father teaching her how to read and write, but this Taliban guy, Idris, gets so upset by this act, claiming that he is breaking the law. And clearly, working is not well regarded.
This is true, Wendy. Actually, female labor force in Afghanistan was reported at 21% in 2019. According to the World Bank collection of development indicators compiled from official recognized sources, it is believed that women do not need to work because they can get everything thanks to their husbands. In fact, through the early 90s, women were teachers, government workers, and medical doctors. They worked as professors, lawyers, journalists, writers, and poets. However, during the Taliban rule between 1996 until 2001, women were strictly limited in their ability to work in public places. They were allowed to set up their own businesses from their homes if they had the means to do so. They were also permitted to work in certain medical positions, but could only treat female patients. Women with children were not permitted to do any kind of work, and widows also were affected, especially by restrictions on women's employment and movement.
Definitely a difficult and challenging situation. There is another topic that is covered in the film and is directly related to the place of women in Afghan society, that is arranged marriages. It is known that 70 to 80% of women face forced marriage. Even some of them are married before their 18th birthday. In the movie is Soraya's case. Fatima is forced to write to a relative in Mazar-e-Sharif, offering Soraya for an arranged marriage with one of her younger cousins in exchange for shelter and protection, meaning there is no other way to help herself. Statistics from 2014 show that 80% of all suicides are committed by women, making Afghanistan one of the few places in the world where rates are higher among women. Psychologists attribute this anomaly to an endless cycle of domestic violence and poverty. The 2008 Global Rights Survey found that nearly 90% of Afghan women have experienced domestic abuse. Literally, they never have any choices, and as they said, if they did have choice, they wouldn't get married, but they are all handcuffed in that country. As well, abuse against women is hardly criminalized, and most of the time they are married while feeling miserable. And when women try to speak up, most of the time there is no one listening. It is known that the Afghan government has been an unreliable supporter and sometimes even an enemy of women's rights. The administration of the country brushed aside women's rights. They have mostly rebuffed activist demands for women to have full participation. But there is still hope, and a year ago, Afghan feminists at first argued that there should be no negotiations with the Taliban. We know that it's a group that refused to recognize women's full humanity, but today those calls are all but gone. Women have mostly accepted that the only way to find peace and get respected is negotiating.
This situation is also possible to be perceived in Colombia, and it is very complex too. Legally, Colombia is a country that constantly works to recognize women's rights and empowerment as a way to achieve and promote gender equality. UN Women give some examples, such as the public policy guidelines for women's gender equality and the comprehensive plan to assure women have a life free of violence, which was approved in 2012. In 2011, the Victims and Restitution of Land law was approved with important provisions on gender equality. Also, the law 1257, which says, whereby regulations are issued to raise awareness, prevent and punish forms of violence and discrimination against women in 2008. And finally, the law 1719 in 2014, by which measures are set in place to guarantee access to justice to victims of sexual violence, especially sexual violence during the armed conflict. However, the reality is different. The UN warns about alarming rates of violence against women. The National Institute of Legal Medicine of Colombia reported that in 2014, 1,000 women were murdered. 37,881 women registered some case of violence against their dignity. The majority of them were perpetrated by their intimate partner. We also have to acknowledge the situation of Afro-Colombian indigenous women because they are usually the most vulnerable. More than 3,000 cases of murder in indigenous and Afro-Colombian individuals, 65% were women. Colombian culture has also some horrible attitudes against women. For example, the fathers are used to overprotect their daughters during their adolescence. Girls cannot go outside for so long. They have to answer all the messages that were sent to them immediately. They cannot hang out with other boys, and they are not allowed to find a boyfriend before 18 years of age or even more. However, if the girl lives with her brother, for example, similar age and interests, they are usually encouraged to go out and enjoy their life stage. Another example is the fact that women have to behave properly wherever they are. They have to show obedience, kindness, and neatness, and any other action would trigger gossip and descriptions against their persona.
It's true, and it's really devastating how the abuse of women doesn't stop, not here, not there in Afghanistan. And that last part that you mentioned sounds kind of old fashioned, but nowadays these actually happen. Now, as the movie is about a little girl who lives in Afghanistan, meanwhile the war against the Taliban is present, we would like to talk about the impact of conflict on children. In the case of Afghanistan, we see a Taliban regime full of violence, and here in Colombia, the armed conflict. In the Breadwinner, we see Parwana dealing every day with a violent environment, and soon her little brother will be a victim of that. In reality, there is nothing different. To analyze Afghanistan's situation, here are some shocking UNICEF numbers. An estimated 20 million children wake up every day in fear of gunshots or bombs and being killed in their streets, schools, or homes. Likewise, 84% of the victims of explosives are children. 274 children were enlisted for combat or support roles. More than 4 million children are out of school. A high percent of them are girls, because schools are closed due to violence in 2018. 600,000 of them are suffering with severe malnutrition, and sadly, these numbers are increasing. Just this year, Afghan children have to deal with grave violations to their dignities and humanity. A lot of them were killed or faced an experience of sexual violence and were denied to receive humanitarian help. Thus, children are one of the most affected in war. There is trauma, pain, living in fear all the time, having nothing to eat, being abused. This is common in Afghanistan nowadays.
So, as you can see, there is no huge difference between children from Colombia and Afghanistan. There were many cases of Colombian children last decade who lost their life or were maimed while playing in a minefield. Currently, it is possible to see sexual abuse in children in 2020, this year in Colombia. Many cases of children's sexual aggression were informed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Colombia is not a safe place for children. There is a horrible situation regarding children here because although it is possible to know how many children are forced to participate in armed conflict, official figures estimate that the FARC alone recruited at least 11,000 children and young people into its ranks between 1972 and 2014. These children are recruited for purposes including information gathering, surveillance, and direct involvement in hostilities. Another problem is the sexual and gender-based violence because it is a critical danger to youth. Armed groups and criminal gangs in Colombia use sexual exploitation and the threat of abuse as a means of exercising social control in their areas of influence. The majority of victims are female, including an increasing number of girls between the ages of 10 and 14. Finally, the production of illegal drugs and illegal gold mining operations see many children forced into difficult and dangerous forms of labor. Children and young involved in the drug trade typically work as plantation workers or drug couriers, posing a threat to their physical safety.
Well, as you could hear, we have tried to expose, on the one hand, the current situation of women in Afghanistan and Colombia, highlighting the atrocious acts on women's rights. We also focus our attention on those aspects that have made of these two societies an attempt against the integrity of women. As well, we stand up that there are policies and wishes for these to change. On the other hand, we talked about childhood in these two countries and how the conflict has mistreated them. In short, these two aspects we find to be the ones that the film The Breadwinner has wanted to expose from an inspiring point of view, where Parwana trusts that one day she will be able to leave the place and live better.
Yes, in this sense, we just want to show you all the problems that we are still facing in this decade. Even though there were some attempts to solve those situations, we can see that we need to work more in order to stop any kind of hostility against women and children. So, thanks for listening to us today, and we wait for you next week kindly. Ciao!
Ciao, bye bye.